Today's episode of the Back in Shape podcast, we're going to be talking all about sciatica. We're going to go through what it is not and what it is, more importantly. And then at the end of the podcast, or the second half, we're going to go through some strategies to deal with your sciatica. So if you're someone that's struggling, hopefully the understanding part at the start of today's episode is really going to help you look at your sciatica in a different way, the proper way, and steer you away from some of the mistakes that so often are made for those suffering sciatica, whether it's really, really severe, going all the way down the leg, or whether it's in pockets, you've got that burning in the shin or some pain into the big toe. We're going to break through all of that so you can stop making mistakes, and then we'll have a nice step-by-step instructional guidance that you can do at the end of this episode that's really going to hopefully give you some action points moving forwards that are more in alignment with what sciatica actually is. And I think the best way to start out today's episode is with a little bit of an example of what sciatica is not. Sciatica is not a leg problem. It is not a muscle problem. It is not a burning problem. It is not a bit pain in the big toe. Yes, those are features of the issue, but it is not a diagnosis in of itself. And the best way to help you reframe sciatica in a real world example is going to be thinking of banging your funny bone. And this might sound a little bit peculiar to start out with, but we all know that there's a little nerve, or many of us know that there is a little nerve on the inside of our elbow, and this comes down and it goes down into various areas of the hand. And we've all been there, we've put our elbow down on the table or knocked something, and all of a sudden we've got shooting pain, tingling numbness going into our hand in various areas. And it's always the same areas, or a mixture of the same sort of areas when we do that. Why is that? Well, that is because the brain knows that the nerve that comes from this area of the hand and the forearm controls certain sensations, and that if any signals come along that nerve up to the brain, they must have come from the hand. And when we bang our elbow like that, we kind of hijack that particular nerve. We bang it right in a vulnerable spot, just on the inside of the elbow here. And that kind of creates a ripple effect, if you will, and sends signals up the nerve. And the brain goes, oh, that was peculiar. I guess we've got sensation going on here, and makes your consciousness aware of the tingling, the horrible sensation that happens down into that forearm and hand at that moment in time. And if you could do one thing as a result of this podcast, it would be use that understanding to help you understand your sciatica. Sciatica is, in a better way of phrasing it, lumbogenic leg pain. Lumbogenic meaning it comes from the lumbar spine, and making the acknowledgement, which it is, that it is leg pain, or it might be leg numbness, or it might be leg tingling. Whatever the specific nuance of sensations that you're particularly feeling, that's not particularly important in this particular part. But know that those sensations are the cause of an actual diagnosis in the lower back. And that could be a myriad of different things. It could be that you've got spondylolisthesis. It could be that you've got a disc bulge. It could be that you've got some degenerative disc disease down there. It could be that we've got some facet irritation, some facet joint hypertrophy, and other issues that you might find on an examination, on MRI imaging, on X-ray imaging, etc. But there is a diagnosis for the lower back that is causing your sciatica. If you get diagnosed with sciatica, unfortunately, it is about as useful as saying you've got leg pain. It doesn't really tell you very much. And actually, if you've got leg pain because you've actually torn a tendon, because you know you did that at a specific point in time, then having leg pain is a bit more of a helpful diagnosis. But when it comes to sciatica, you have to get rid of this belief that it in itself is a diagnosis. It is no different to saying that you just have leg pain that's coming from the lower back. And if you can start thinking about it as lumbogenic leg pain, you're going to do an awful lot more you're going to do an awful lot better in your recovery process. And the main reason for that is that you will steer clear of so many of the common mistakes that people make when they have sciatica. And I'm going to go through a couple of them now. The very first one is just this endless stretching. Hey, John, you've got some sciatic pain. Your hamstrings are tightened up. There's a reason for that. Your calves are tightened up, and you've got that numbness or burning on the outside of your shin. You need to stretch the muscles, because that's the problem. It's sciatic leg pain. And that is where the issues start. How do we go about that stretching? We bend down, we touch our toes, the stretching sensation feels nice, we feel a little bit looser immediately afterwards, and we carry on with our day. But what's happened? We've done a specific thing, which I'll get to in a moment, And that's temporarily alleviated some of the pressure buildup, irritating that sciatic nerve. Because as we mentioned earlier with the elbow example, there is something in the lower back, be it a disc bulge or some excess inflammation that's built up in that area, that is irritating the sciatic nerve in the lower back. And by you doing that peculiar movement as you go down to do your hamstring stretch, or as you round over to do your glute stretch, you do something in the lower back, as I said, which I'll get to in a moment. The next common one is going to be the piriformis. This is one of those muscles. It's a tiny muscle. It's so small. It's one of many, and it's underneath the glutes, large muscle groups and it basically is so often, oh, you've got piriformis syndrome. That's what's causing your sciatica. And we did a dedicated episode on this, so I won't bore you with the details here, but fundamentally, it is supposed that this small tiny muscle and none of the others has randomly decided to tighten up on its own, and that's compressing and irritating your sciatic nerve, a nerve that's gone through the piriformis or next to the piriformis for your entire life, but just now it is the cause of the problem. And the reality here again is that when we injure a nerve, when we compress a nerve, irritate a nerve in any meaningful way, as I mentioned earlier, disc bulges, excess inflammation, etc., you can get a number of issues. Some of those are going to be sensory. So that means that you feel a sensation, pain, burning, tingling, whatever the case may be. And then some of them are going to be motor. And the motor means that you get certain muscle spasm, tensions, etc. in certain muscles. And we have to understand that the lower section of our lumbar spine, the L4-5 and the L5-S1 region, they go and control muscles like the hamstrings, the glutes, the calves, all the muscles that are in that chain that you're feeling as tight. And one of those muscles happens to be the piriformis amongst the other muscles in that particular area, the lateral rotators of the hip. And those muscles are going to go into spasm as a result of the injury in the back. Again, lumbogenic reaction in the legs. And so that's going to be why that piriformis is tight. And it may well be aggravating things. It may well be in a spastic state of contraction, really pinching down on that sciatic nerve at that point too. But stretching the piriformis does not do anything to address the cause of the sciatica, which is in the lower back. And again, think about the positions of that figure 4 piriformis stretch. Think about what position you might get yourself into to try and alleviate that pain. And yes, it feels nice when you do it. Know that we're not, I wouldn't say or even consider suggesting that they don't feel nice when you do these stretches, because 9 times out of 10, they really do. However, again, same problem. Think about that. So we've got the hamstring stretching and the glute stretching, round over, stretch those muscles, really pull them. Then we've got the piriformis figure 4, very similar maybe to some of the glute stretches you've done. Again, rounding, pulling that knee in, getting that piriformis, really stretch it out. Just think about the posture that you'd be adopting when you're doing that. And then we've got sciatic flossing. Another one, we round over, we straighten our leg out, and here we're kind of thinking about our lower back as like a tooth, and we're kind of pulling the sciatic nerve. Now, this is the only one perhaps that maybe has the implication that maybe the sciatic pain isn't the problem and actually there's something going on, because we're suggesting perhaps that the sciatic nerve is being trapped somewhere and it needs to be flossed out. And that to me just never sounds particularly good. But again, think about the posture that you're in when you're doing that. Now, what do all these have in common? Well, I would suggest that in a lot of cases, and I don't have the answer here to be completely honest with you guys, but it'd be interesting to look at, all of these have flexion involved. All of them round the lower back. One of the big problems with sciatica is that where the little nerves come out of the spine, we have finite holes, and those nerves go through the hole. And those holes can be made larger or smaller, but in an upright neutral position, they're of a certain size. As we bend forward, we make the hole larger. Now, if there's pressure built up in that area from inflammation around a degenerate disc, a damaged facet joint, or whatever the case may be, as we bend forwards, we're going to alleviate that pressure because we make the hole larger, and therefore the pressure within the hole will reduce. So every single one of those stretches, I wonder how much of that is the relief that you get, as momentary as it is, how much of that is actually just the flexion that's being done. No different to a knee hug stretch, no different to a child's pose stretch. They're touted as being specific stretches, but they're no different. How much of the relief that you're getting is actually just the fact that you're taking pressure off that particular area that is pressurized in the lower back? Now, the big issue with that, whether it's one or the other, it kind of doesn't matter at this point. The simple fact of the matter is doing that sort of movement, as we've discussed in many other episodes of the podcast, such as specifically the child's pose, cat-cow, flattening your lumbar spine, where we talk about all these things, that is not good for the diagnosis in your lower back of, let's say, the herniated disc, the bulging disc, the degenerative disc disease, the spondylolisthesis, etc. It's not helpful for those particular conditions, and it's actually making the problem worse. And I won't go into the details here. You can check out some of the other episodes of the podcast to go into the weeds there. But fundamentally, that's an issue. You get hooked on this moment-to-moment relief. You find that a year goes by, 6 months goes by, 2 or 3 months go by, and you're still doing these stretches, and you get that moment of relief, but it's happening less and less, or the relief is lasting less and less time. and you're thinking, this isn't really progressive. I'm not getting anywhere with this. I'm going round in circles. And the reason being, you're just chasing symptoms. Maybe you are stretching those muscles, but you're just opening out that hole again, making the problem worse. It feels temporarily relieving, and then it goes back, and we're just stuck in this cycle over and over again. So we need to take a step back, understand that sciatica is a back problem, giving you symptoms that are in the leg. Understand that it commonly focuses around about L4-5 and L5-S1, that the injury, the issue is actually located. And understand that we need to address certain principles, or have certain principles to our recovery, so that we are supporting a healthy spine and not reinforcing bad postures, bad movements, and fundamentally aggravating movements for the underlying cause of the problem. So we'll get into sort of, hopefully now, the more helpful part of this podcast. If anything that we've said so far doesn't quite make sense, you're not quite sure, maybe you want to link to one of those particular podcast episodes that we did mention, please do post it in the comments below or on this page that you're watching the episode on, and we'll happily guide you to the relevant bit. Just post a question down in there. We read and reply to all of those. So what are we going to do about getting and actually fixing our sciatica? We want to look at it in a new way. Look at it as that way of lumbogenic leg pain. Something wrong with the lower back. So the very first and most important principle, in short, is that those lower back injuries are a flexion and compression problem in most of society. We spend a significant amount, I think it was 9 or 9.5 or 8.5 hours a day sitting. I've quoted it many times on recent podcasts, so it's around that sort of ballpark. It's a lot of time sitting every day, rounded through our lower back, squashing down on those discs. And that is a issue that leads to the cause of the problem in that lower back. And really, whether it's a spondylolisthesis, whether it's a disc bulge, whether it's a herniation, whether there's some facet joint irritation at the same time, that matters quite little. The most important thing is we start off in this area by trying to reduce the inflammation or reduce the excess inflammation. Now, you'll see a lot of stuff online about inflammation being good, because it is, it helps us heal. And in the peripheral joints, the knees, the elbows, the wrists, etc., there's plenty of room, plenty of play, plenty of flexibility in the soft tissues to accommodate excess inflammation building up. But in the case of the lower back, specifically the lower lumbar spine, but other areas too, there is a finite amount of space because we've got bony tubes, not soft tissue tubes, so they don't stretch very well. And as inflammation builds up in there to excessive levels, you want to lean forwards, which gets you into the trap of doing things that make you worse. Fundamentally, to try and alleviate the pain. So we want to try and externally control or get a handle on that excess inflammation, and using icing over that lower back, directly over the spine. And again, you might be thinking, hey, Mike, I thought this, it's my leg pain. It's pain down the leg. You've got to focus on the cause of the problem. It's like trying to throw water on the smoke over here when the fire's over here. You're not going to have any success if you don't put things in the right place. So we're using icing directly over the lower lumbar spine. Easy way to find that. Place 2 fingers on the little dimples at the base of your spine, come into where they meet and come up about an inch, and around about there is a perfect spot to pop the icing. We do that for 3 to 5 minutes is what we normally recommend. If you feel like you want to and have the time and the patience to do so, contrast bathing can work particularly well here, especially those of you that have some more degenerative issues in the lower back. And that's where we do sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes at a time of heat, and then immediately ice after, then heat, then immediately ice after, then heat, then immediately ice after, and then we leave it with ice, and then we just get on with what we're doing. We don't bend down or flex or anything like that immediately afterwards. We just walk around with good posture. That can help calm things down a little bit in a more pertinent or more efficient manner, focused. Whereas when we think of oral anti-inflammatories, it just affects the whole body, and maybe that could have detrimental effects elsewhere. We all know that things like ibuprofen, etc., are going to have problems with our gut. Well, just on a complete tangent here, if we're trying to heal our body and we're affecting the area that we absorb nutrients and making it inflamed or irritated, that might not necessarily be the smartest move. It might impact our recovery process. So just something to think about there. Step number 2 is that we're going to do things to actually decompress, unload the spine. Unlike the stretches that we've discussed earlier, which compress down on that front of the disc, driving the material backwards, aggravating the area, stretching tissues that are trying to tighten back up again, we jump on the towel stretch, which again, we have a full podcast on this and many videos, which gently decompresses the spine, holds it in a nice neutral position. We've also got the bed decompression stretch, again, video on the YouTube channel where you can check that out. How to do that. Very, very easy stretches that absolutely everyone can do that support a healthy spine, that provide a little bit of respite, unload the spine, unload the ligaments, the joints, the muscles that are around that region of the lower back to start to give it some respite. And you can do this alongside the icing that I mentioned a number of times a day. There's not really a limit, but it's there to interrupt the the pathology process that builds during the day, because ultimately we've got a weakness in the lower back that probably is going to be poorly resistant to the loads of life and daily living and the things that you probably are still doing every single day anyway, going to work, looking after the kids, because you've got to do those things whether you've got sciatica or not. You can't just lie in bed, and that's not a good thing either. So those are little antidotes to the stresses of daily life. And then we have the core engagement and wall drill. And this is where you're kind of standing up straight. You've got your heels, bum, middle back, head against the wall. And many of you will find that when you first start to do this, especially if you've been stuck doing those loopy exercises that I mentioned earlier, it actually might cause you pain. But that's why you're doing those first two exercises, to try and calm down the inflammation. Because the primary reason when you try and do the wall drill and stand up straight, properly straight, firstly, you'll be like, oh my God, is this actually what straight feels like? It's way more upright than I normally am. I'm leaning forwards all the time. And the reason that's painful is because those holes have been stuck in perpetuity, enlarged. So you've allowed inflammation to build up excessively in that area. And it might take a couple of days for you to actually be able to stand up straight again and get those holes back to a normal size. What does that mean? If those holes are enlarged, that means you've been permanently flexing the lower back, permanently leaning forwards when you've been standing, and therefore permanently increasing the mechanical strain on your lower back every single day without being aware of it. That's a real problem. And again, that's something, if we understand that the lower back is the cause of this issue in our leg, this sciatic pain, then we can start making wiser decisions. But that might well, and I know for many people with sciatica, just standing up against that wall is an actual eye-opening experience in of itself. And you realize, gosh, I'm walking every day. I'm just walking with more load on my back. No wonder I'm in pain. No wonder my sciatica is flaring up by the time I go to, by the time midday comes, let alone by the time I go to bed. And then you go to bed and you've got leg pain because you've been aggravating it all day. It's no wonder you've got leg pain. So hopefully that helps. And the final thing with that wall drill is getting that core engagement to provide that external stability to your midsection, to your lower lumbar spine, using your own muscles that are built there, learning to use them properly, not doing a pelvic tuck when you do the core engagement. Those little things will really make a massive difference in the early days of recovery. And then we get into the more long-standing side of things. Those first three are kind of there to a certain degree, stop you making yourself worse. But we have to start to rebuild strength, tolerance, and resilience in the lower back. And the only way to do that is starting to do proper real-to-life resistance-based training. And that is starting to learn the simple movements like the squats, doing exercises on the floor like the dead bugs to start to learn proper core engagement in a safe environment that's not going to be too strenuous for your lower back, that you can learn in almost like a sandbox, learn how to engage the core while the legs are moving so that the lower back doesn't start to move. Because when you allow the lower back to move, that's when you're going to pinch the roots of that sciatic nerve. That's when your pain is going to aggravate. And in a nice, safe environment like a dead bug on the floor, yes, it might hurt, but it's very, very safe. It's not, there's not lots of forces at play. But if you're trying to run around the house chasing after a 3-year-old, or you're moving, the kettle or carrying the shopping, there's a lot more forces at play, and failure to do that is going to be much more problematic for you, much more provoking, much more likely to lead to a more pronounced aggravation or flare-up. So we learn to do these movements safely. Then we look at things like the squats, things like the hip hinges, the lunges, etc., that can start to build safe movement and then add load to those sorts of movements so that we can build resilience. We need to safely, in a controlled manner, put load back through our spine as we go through a healing process to make it stronger. Too often, those that get quick relief from those early 3 steps that I mentioned earlier, those are the ones that actually do the worst often in the long term, because they think, oh, I'm okay now, I can just crack on and go back to all the silly things that I was doing before that caused my sciatica in the first place. And then they wonder why it keeps coming back. And the simple fact of the matter is, those sorts of things do not make your back stronger. It's been damaged. It needs to not only heal, but then as it goes through a healing process, you need to add load to the spine so that it knows how strong to get. And it needs to get stronger than it currently is. If you're thinking about perhaps going on holiday, you're going to be carrying a 20-kilo suitcase, most likely, and maybe more if you've got kids and another half, and you're going to be carrying that as well. You need to think about these sorts of things. If you're worried about picking up a 2 or 3 or 5 kilo or even a 10-kilo kettlebell to start doing some proper resistance training, obviously at the right time with the right guidance, of course. But if you're worried about doing that, yet you don't think about going on holiday, or you just do it anyway, we really have our priorities the wrong way around. Do we really want to recover, or are we getting caught out because we got a little bit of relief now? We think we're okay. We haven't done anything to strengthen ourselves back up. And no wonder we get a flare up in the middle of our holiday. So that's something really to think about, especially this time of year. We're shooting this in the middle of August. Maybe people are coming back from their holidays, etc., or going away just before the kids go back to school. Think about these sorts of things. Have you done the resilience work when your symptoms went away to allow you to put strain on your back safely? Or have you just been walking a tightrope on tenterhooks, not aware of the vulnerability that's still there because the symptoms have gone away? And that's really important to think about as well. Final point I think I'll throw it in there is just about treatment. How can treatment help you along with these sorts of things? You've got physiotherapists, you've got osteopaths, you've got chiropractors. They're kind of one category. I'll cover another category in a moment. What are those guys doing? Well, they are in many cases, you're going to have your osteo and your chiropractor, depending on the techniques they use. They're going to try and work on your thoracic spine. They're going to try and work on your hips, your knees, your ankles, etc., to get the muscles and the joints working as well as possible around that lower back that's injured, so that it can try and go through a less encumbered healing process. They're working on other areas to mean that these other areas can take the strain, so your lower back can have an easier time healing on a daily basis, and that can be helpful. And then you've got the physios, which typically speaking are going to do a little bit more in the way of muscle work. Osteos kind of being somewhere in the middle, joint and muscle, and chiros tending to be more joint-related work. And they're going to work to try and get those muscles to relax. Yes, having your hamstrings a little bit more relaxed is going to be helpful for the lower back. Of course, having the thoracic spine a little bit more mobile is going to be helpful so that the lower back doesn't have to get involved in movement and strain itself while it's unstable, while it's trying to heal. However, that does not take away from the fact that none of those therapies can rebuild your muscle strength. Only you can do that. So if you're going to choose those sorts of avenues, have the appropriate expectation, because people often get very disenfranchised. They say, oh, well, I did a treatment with my physio and it didn't work. I did a treatment with my osteo, my chiro, whoever it was, and it didn't work. I felt better, and then it came back. And it came back because you didn't do your work. You didn't do your resistance work properly, and you didn't incorporate good habits going forwards to properly rebuild the resilience. There is a chance that you had a bit of bad luck. Maybe you got hit by a car, or some other accidents happen, and those do happen, unfortunately, before we break a leg or something like that, and that throws things off, and those are unlucky, unfortunate, and they're just happenstance. But we must make sure that we understand very clearly that our therapists, whoever they are, specialists, the treatment that we have is not building resilience. It's helping us heal ourselves. And we must do the work outside of the treatment room. And then we get on to sort of two personal favorite treatments. You've got things like the IDD therapy and you've got laser therapy. Those, unlike the previous treatments that I mentioned, those can actually work directly on the cause. So in the case of decompression, we can directly unload some of the discs. You'll see that there's similarities here between the towel exercise, the decompression that you're doing at home, and something like IDD therapy, which directly takes load off that, let's say, L4-5 disc and helps it go through a healing process more effectively. And the same thing for laser. These are things where you can just lie there. You don't need to do anything. It's passive, and the treatment is done on that area that is sore. But again, those people get false expectations of those, that they are fixing the back. They are helping the back heal, maybe more effectively than maybe some other therapies, because they're able to target the back specifically. But you must do your resilience work. Otherwise, the strength of the tissues you've built up, you have to understand, in your lower back through life, through the activities that you've done, often more so in your formative years, teenage years, where you've been doing stuff more before you got stuck behind a desk for X numbers of hours a day or just very inactive. You've built, and if you are someone who has committed to doing resistance training over the years, then this disparity is maybe more pronounced in you in some ways. You may be at a disadvantage in some ways, not loads, but a slight disadvantage. We've built up a ton of resilience in our body in general and in our back. When we have an injury, that plummets down to here. The resilience has gone. And then the healing process of just passive healing is going to take us back up to here. But we then we're used to having a body that's this strong. So we then need to use our resistance training work, our load on the spine, to help guide it to make itself stronger again. That's the important part, to reinforce that section of the lower back. And that's the bit that is so often missing when we have any of these sort of therapeutic interventions. We don't do the rehab properly, and we don't strengthen effectively. That is really the final part of really fixing a sciatica. So in review, understanding that your sciatica is a lumbogenic leg pain. It is something that is coming from the lower back and gives you experiences in the leg. No different to banging our elbow and getting experiences in our sort of quote unquote funny bone in our hand. Understand that the exercises that you've done in the past, the stretches, the piriformis stretches, the flossing, the rounding of your lower back, although it felt good, was getting you stuck into a cycle of doing the wrong things. Understand that if we start to target the reality that lower back issues that cause sciatica or don't cause sciatica are a compression and flexion activity. They are something that has compressed and flexed the spine, which has led to the injury, either in a one-off instance or more commonly, repetitive strain has built up and eroded those tissues over many years. Then we need to use some icing and or contrast bathing to try and calm down the buildup of excess inflammation in our lower back. We want to do things like the towel exercise and the bed decompression to provide unloading to the lumbar spine that is gentle and controlled. We want to also learn to stand with the effective posture and engage our core to provide moment-to-moment protection around the house, especially when we're in those vulnerable periods. And that might be a little bit of a painful process, as we discussed earlier, to start with. But if you do it right, you're going to find you can get up there in a couple of days. You're going to be much straighter than you were before, which is only going to have advantages to you. And then the all-important part of building that resistance training, steadily making progress, building the resistance that you're putting on that spine to help that healing process take place and the resilience be restored to your lower back, so you are no longer vulnerable to simple daily activities that might aggravate you. And if you want to do more strenuous activities, sports, other activities, then you need to build more resilience to make you safe, competent, and effective at doing those sorts of things without the risk of injury. Hopefully this has been a helpful one and quite insightful when it comes to sciatica. And we've given you some active or some proactive tools you can take away there. Of course, those of you that are members that watch this, you're already doing that. Hopefully this has been a reminder for you guys of some of the quirks of things like sciatica and giving you sort of that step-by-step on in terms of moving forwards. And you're already covering those bases when you're going through the program. So don't worry. If you've got any questions, post them in the comments below. As always, if you found this video helpful, please consider sharing it with someone else who's been struggling with their sciatica. Hopefully it'll help them look at things in the right way, get rid of some of those erroneous beliefs, and they can start moving towards recovery, because it can be really debilitating if we've got bad sciatica, and it can really, suck the enjoyment out of every single day. So it's not a nice condition to have, especially when it's particularly noticeable and particularly chronic. So as always, again, if you do find these episodes helpful, consider subscribing to the channel. We release a new one every single Saturday or Sunday, depending on the exact hours. And we'll see you in the next episode of the Back in Shape podcast. Thanks for watching.